Have you ever agreed to something you didn't want to do just because you didn't want to deal with the reaction? Maybe a friend asks you for another favor and you're already exhausted. You want to say no, but instead you say, "Sure, I guess I can." Maybe someone keeps calling you late at night. You don't want to answer anymore, but you feel guilty ignoring them. Or someone constantly makes little comments that bother you. You laugh them off, you tell yourself it's not a big deal, and then one day you suddenly explode. You finally say everything you've been holding inside. And somehow you're the one who looks unreasonable. This is one of the strangest things about boundaries. The longer you avoid setting them, the more likely you are to eventually set them in anger. And that's why healthy boundaries aren't about becoming cold, selfish, or difficult. They're about learning how to communicate what you can and cannot accept before resentment has a chance to build. Because a boundary isn't a punishment, it isn't a threat, and it isn't an attempt to control another person. A boundary is simply a clear statement about what you will do when something doesn't work for you. And once you understand that distinction, setting boundaries becomes much easier. Number one, stop thinking that no requires a defense. One of the biggest reasons people struggle with boundaries is that they believe they need a good enough reason to say no. So instead of simply saying, "I can't do that," they start building a courtroom case. "I can't because I've been really busy lately and I already have a lot going on. And maybe next week would work, but I'm not sure." The more you explain, the more opportunities you give someone to negotiate. Because if your boundary depends on your explanation, the other person can attack the explanation. "You're busy? I'll only need 5 minutes. You're tired? You can do it tomorrow. You already have plans? Can't you change them?" Suddenly, your boundary has become a debate. But you don't need to win a debate to have a boundary. Sometimes the healthiest answer is simply, "I won't be able to do that." And then stop talking. You don't need 10 reasons. You don't need permission. And you don't need the other person to agree that your reason is good enough. Number two, understand the difference between discomfort and danger. This is where boundaries become psychologically complicated, because saying no can feel uncomfortable. Especially if you're used to keeping everyone happy. You might feel guilty, you might feel selfish, you might even feel like you've done something wrong, but feeling guilty doesn't automatically mean you've done something wrong. Sometimes guilt is simply the emotional sensation of doing something you aren't used to doing. Imagine you've spent years automatically saying yes. Your brain learns, keeping people happy keeps me safe. Then one day, you say no. Your brain doesn't immediately celebrate your new independence. It may sound an alarm. What if they're angry? What if they leave? What if they think I'm a bad person? That fear can feel incredibly real. But discomfort and danger are not the same thing. Someone being disappointed by your boundary doesn't necessarily mean you've harmed them. Someone being annoyed doesn't automatically mean you've been unfair, and someone refusing to accept your boundary doesn't mean the boundary is wrong. Sometimes you're simply experiencing the discomfort of choosing yourself. Number three, say what you will do, not what they must do. This is one of the most powerful changes you can make. Weak boundaries often sound like attempts to control another person. "You need to stop talking to me like that," but you can't control what another person says. A stronger boundary focuses on your own behavior. If the conversation becomes disrespectful, "I'm going to leave." Notice the difference. The first statement demands that another person change. The second tells them what you will do. That's important because boundaries aren't really about controlling other people. They're about controlling your participation. You can't force someone to respect you, but you can decide what behavior you're willing to remain around. You can't force someone to communicate calmly, but you can decide to end a conversation when it becomes aggressive. You can't force someone to stop asking you for favors, but you can stop automatically saying yes. That's where boundaries become powerful, not because they control other people, but because they give you control over your own actions. Number four, don't wait until you're angry. A lot of people don't actually have bad boundaries. They have late boundaries. They tolerate something 10 times, then explode on the 11th. They say, "It's fine." Then, "It's okay." Then, "Don't worry about it." Then, "Seriously, it's fine." Until suddenly, it's very much not fine. The problem isn't always the final reaction. It's everything that happened before it. Healthy boundaries are usually quieter. You notice something bothering you. You communicate it early. You give the other person an opportunity to understand. And if nothing changes, you adjust your behavior. That is much healthier than silently collecting evidence against someone until you finally explode. Think of resentment like pressure inside a container. A small boundary releases a little pressure. Silence allows the pressure to keep building. Eventually, something breaks. So don't wait until you're furious to communicate what bothers you. Say it while you're still calm enough to say it clearly. Number 5. Use fewer words. This sounds almost too simple, but it's incredibly powerful. When you're nervous about setting a boundary, you tend to over-explain. You start talking faster. You add apologies. You soften every sentence. You say, "I'm really sorry, and I hope you don't take this the wrong way, and I know this might sound weird, but..." And before you've even reached your boundary, you've already made it sound negotiable. Try something simpler. "I can't commit to that. I'm not comfortable with that. I need some time to myself tonight. I'm not available this weekend. I'd rather not discuss that." Simple, calm, clear, and then let the silence exist. You don't have to rush in and rescue the other person from their reaction. Sometimes silence feels uncomfortable because you're waiting for them to approve your boundary, but that's not your responsibility. You can be kind without being apologetic for having limits. Number 6. Expect some people to push back. Here's something important that nobody tells you about boundaries. A boundary can reveal the quality of a relationship. People who are used to unlimited access to you may be surprised when you suddenly become more selective. Someone who benefited from your constant availability may call you distant. Someone who benefited from your inability to say no may call you selfish. Someone who was comfortable crossing your limits may suddenly accuse you of changing. And technically, they're right. You are changing. You're changing the rules of your participation, but that doesn't necessarily make you a bad person. Sometimes people don't dislike your boundary. They dislike the fact that your boundary removes an advantage they were receiving. That's why you shouldn't measure the health of your boundary by how happy everyone is with it. Measure it by whether you're communicating it honestly, respectfully, and consistently. Number 7. Don't punish people with your boundary. There is another extreme to avoid. After years of being too accommodating, some people discover boundaries and swing completely in the opposite direction. They become cold. They stop explaining anything. They ignore messages deliberately. They use silence as punishment. They say things like, "That's your problem. I don't care. Deal with it." That's not healthy boundary setting. That's often resentment wearing a new outfit. You don't need to become cruel to become assertive. You can say, "I understand that you're disappointed, but my answer is still no." You can care about someone's feelings without changing your decision. That's emotional maturity. You can have empathy without surrendering your boundary. Number 8, learn the most important sentence. There is one sentence that can completely change the way you handle difficult situations. "I understand, but I'm still not comfortable with that." Someone disagrees? "I understand, but I'm still not comfortable with that." Someone keeps negotiating? "I understand, but my decision hasn't changed." Someone becomes disappointed? "I understand that you're disappointed. I'm still not able to do it." Notice what's missing. You're not attacking. You're not defending yourself. You're not trying to convince them. You're simply acknowledging their perspective while maintaining your own. That's what calm assertiveness looks like. Number 9, remember, a boundary isn't meant to make everyone happy. This might be the hardest lesson. You can set a boundary perfectly, and someone can still dislike it. You can communicate respectfully, and someone can still become angry. You can explain yourself clearly, and someone can still misunderstand you. And that's okay, because the goal of a boundary isn't to create universal approval. The goal is to create clarity. You are saying, "This is what I'm comfortable with. This is what I'm not comfortable with. This is what I'm willing to participate in, and this is what I'll do if that line is crossed." That's clarity. And healthy relationships can survive clarity. In fact, healthy relationships often become stronger because of it. Number 10. The most powerful boundary is consistency. Anyone can set a boundary once. The difficult part is maintaining it. If you say, "I don't want to have conversations like this," but then stay for another hour every time someone becomes disrespectful, your words eventually lose meaning. A boundary becomes real when your actions consistently support it. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just consistently. If you say you're leaving when the conversation becomes disrespectful, leave. If you say you're unavailable after a certain time, don't keep answering every call. If you say you're not comfortable discussing something, stop defending why. Your consistency teaches people what your words mean, and eventually people learn when this person says no, they mean no. That's not being difficult, that's being predictable. And surprisingly, predictability creates trust. The final lesson. You don't need to become louder to become stronger. You don't need to intimidate people. You don't need to win every argument. And you don't need everyone to understand your decisions. Sometimes strength sounds incredibly ordinary. No, I can't. I'm not comfortable with that. I need some space. I'd rather not discuss that. If this continues, I'm going to leave. That's it. No dramatic speech, no anger, no revenge, just clarity. Because the healthiest boundary isn't the one that makes the other person afraid of losing you. It's the one that makes you stop being afraid of disappointing them. And once you stop confusing someone's disappointment with your wrongdoing, something changes. You stop saying yes because you're afraid. You stop explaining every decision. You stop waiting until you're angry. And you start building relationships where respect doesn't come from avoiding conflict, but from being honest enough to communicate where your limits actually are. Because a boundary isn't a wall between you and other people. It's a doorway with a handle on your side. You decide when it opens, you decide when it closes, and you don't have to feel guilty for having the key.